entitled Ideology, Subject, and Subversion. And the first speaker is Petr Kužel, who, in addition to helping organize this whole event, also has written about ideology, for example, in a book he recently published on Louis Althusser, which is a very good book. I told you that. And is also a colleague of mine at the Czech Academy of Sciences Institute for Philosophy, the Department of for the Study of Modern Czech Philosophy.
Thank you. Good afternoon. When I ask what the ideology is, perhaps the most common answer is to claim that ideology has to do with legitimating the power of dominant social groups. We can say that to study ideology is to study the ways which meaning or signification serves to sustain the relations of domination. This is probably the single most widely accepted definition of ideology, and this process of legitimation seems to involve different strategies. We can enumerate some of the strategies. Dominant power may legitimate itself by promoting beliefs and values congenial to it, naturalizing and universalizing such beliefs so as to render them self-evident and apparently inevitable, denigrating ideas which may challenge it, excluding greater forms of thought, perhaps by some unspoken but systematic logic, and obscuring social reality in ways convenient to the logic itself. These strategies of legitimation, as it's commonly known, frequently takes the form of masking or suppressing social conflicts from which arises the conception of ideology as an imaginary resolution of real contradictions. In any actual ideological formation, these strategies are, of course, works in complex way together. Even though that we can recognize many different aspects of ideology and many different definitions of ideology, in my contribution I will work primarily from the definition that claims that ideology is an imaginary resolution of real contradiction, and it's just the definition from what I am coming from, but I will propose the other definition of other conceptualization of ideology. This approach has, of course, this approach closely related to Althusser's conception of ideology as the representation of the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real condition of existence. In the process of the masking of real contradiction, this process is, of course, something that ideology itself is not aware of. Ideology, at the same time, masks the aleatory character of the reality, which is not as hegemonic as its ideology makes it seem, but in reality is full of what like Althusser calls gaps and blank spaces and voids. He speaks about that explicitly within his conception of aleatory materialism and in text concerning Nicola Machiavelli. We can say that also philosophy, as Joe was speaking this morning about that, plays its role in masking of aleatory character, and the philosophy is important in these things. I will just quote one quote from Althusser. Althusser said that philosophy has a certain relationship with the state, with the power of the apparatus of the state, and specifically with the constitution, that is to say, with the unification and systematization of the dominant ideology, which is the keystone of the ideological hegemony of the class in power. It then strikes me that philosophy was responsible for bringing together the contradictory elements of ideology which every dominant class is confronted with when it comes to power, to help form the dominant ideology for both the dominant and the dominated class. But I'm not going to speak about the role of philosophy, and I would like to try to look at the problem of ideology using Althusser's philosophy of aleatory materialism and this concept of symptomatic reading. Even though these concepts were introduced and elaborated in very different periods of Althusser's intellectual life, and between these periods we can recognize very significant theoretical shifts and jumps and radical negation of previous period, I will try to interlink these concepts, and I will try to show that the concept of symptomatic reading could be useful in analysis of ideology. I'm aware that I can present it here just in a provisional and simplified manner. If we want to speak about symptomatic reading, we need to outline Althusser's conception of theoretical structure. Very roughly speaking, we can say that in the process of theoretical production, theoretical praxis responds to given question and analyzes theoretical object, but in this process it produces unconsciously also the theoretical question and theoretical objects which remain for this very practice invisible. The theoretical praxis produces thus a certain field of visible, its manifest and conscious discourse, but at the same time a field of the invisible, the latent and unconscious discourse. This means it produces the theoretical object and theoretical questions which are produced by its practice, by its very logic, but they are not for the practice visible. And we should say also that between both fields there is a specific relation which is not immediately clear and obvious. As Althusser said, there is a, quote, necessary invisible connection between the field of visible and the field of invisible, a connection which defines the necessity of obscure field of the invisible as a necessary effect of the structure of visible field. The field of invisible is produced by its own theoretical praxis, producing the theoretical structure, and we should stress that this field of invisible is not something external to its process, but is a necessary part of it. The field of invisible is the invisible of its structure. It's not something what would exist before and independently of this theoretical praxis in form of some essence which we could simply recognize or see, but its immanent effect of this structure in the process of its self-development. We can say also that this invisible field is something what the manifest discourse must deny and must not see if it wants to remain itself. So this is an important thing in analysis of ideology. We should also stress that at the same time, manifest discourse presents itself as absolutely coherent and consistent, but the latent discourse, the field of invisible, is present also in its structure and manifests itself in its field of the visible as a symptoms. These symptoms represent certain gaps and blank spaces which undermines the unity of manifest discourse. We can thus reconstruct on the basis of analysis of the system a different and suppressed structure of the text. And that activities presupposes not only that we can discover these gaps in the manifest theoretical structure, but mainly that we can see in this gap the symptoms of the different structure. In other words, that we can see the symptoms of different logic than the logic which is presented to us in its manifest structure. This is also important for analysis of ideology. Even though Althusser speaks in the reading capital about gaps and blank spaces only in the context of theoretical structure, we can transpose his analysis to the social structure and to the problem of ideology. This transposition is not, of course, something unproblematic, but I think that it will be a useful step for analyzing of ideology. Althusser himself speaks about the gaps in his late work when he elaborates aleatory materialism, and more precisely, his later conception of these gaps and void explicitly formulated in aleatory materialism or materialism of encounter is in certain aspect present in his concept of overdetermination already in the 60s. And you can say that even materialism of encounter is presented in the 60s in texts which were not published. And so we can recognize in Althusser's work something what Petr and Balibar called as Althusserism of structure and Althusserism of encounter. And these two, Althusserism always makes certain tension in his work, very well analyzed by Emilio de Icola, but I won't let this problem leave aside. So if we consider the real world as a structure with its manifest and latent discourse, with its field of visible and with the field of invisible, the manifest discourse is linked to the form of how we live and experience our everyday life, and it is linked to our imaginary representation of real condition. It means the ideology. It is how the logic and essence is manifest to itself. It's not something what will be external to this process. And the latent discourse represents a hidden contradictory logic, which is in certain aspect masking by ideology, which is not represent, which represents itself, but not in the immediate way. It must be theoretical constructed. When we speak about the latent and, or it's as Anselm Jape said in the previous panel, it's exoteric and esoteric field of the examination. When we go back to Marx, we can go back for a moment to the type of analysis of Marx who tried to theoretically express the concept of capitalism, the specific logic of specific object, what means that to theoretically express latent structure in its ideal form, its structural causality, and express the dynamism of this structure and theoretically explain its forms of manifestation. This concept is created not via abstraction of concrete things, but by way of theoretical production of concepts which express the hidden logic of the structure. But we can say that in concrete society, any concrete society never corresponds fully to its concept that we are not living in pure capitalism or in pure feudalism. And when we discuss this correspondence with the reality and concept, we can distinguish two notions proposed by Marx, the two phases or stages of society. The phase which Marx called gewordene form, and the phase or stage which Marx called werdende. The first one is the phase when reality corresponds to its concept, even though that it does not correspond fully. By other words, it's the society which stands on its own foundation, on its own feet, the phase when the logic of the system basically occupies and determines the basic rules of the functioning of society, and when society is reproduced with its own mechanism of operating, when quote, presupposition which originally appeared as condition of its becoming now appear as a result of its own realization. Reality is exposited by it, not as a condition of its arising, but as a result of its presence. The second phase, the werdende, is a phase of arising or disappearing form of society when the logic of system is in statu nascendi or in decline, when the structure of the system is not fully covered by this logic. So when it's a phase or stage when condition of production likewise appears as engaged and suspended themselves, and hence depositing the historical presupposition for new state of society. In this phase, when the system is not determined by its own mechanism of functioning, but in the phase when the development and the constitution of its proper logic is much more than in the phase of gewordene form, determined by factors which are aleatory or they escape to the logic of the system and creates grounds or possibilities to other logic, other social order. This presupposition of new order are presented in the manifest discourse of reality in the form of some gaps and blank spaces, in some social phenomena which are not clearly pure, I don't know how to say, capitalist, or it's not governed by its capitalist logic. And now, after this, we can go back to the problem of ideology. Ideology masks or transforms its gaps by mechanism which presents these phenomena not as a symptoms of some potential new social order or emerging logic, but as a simple social phenomenon that belongs to the actual logic, to the capitalist logic, and presented as a simple fact. We can see this system as symptoms or as a precondition for its new logic. It doesn't mean that this new logic must be emancipatory. It could be absolutely other type of the logic, which can take a form of some new feudalism or I don't know what. But it's created by mechanism of capitalism itself, and this is not clearly visible in the manifest structure. They appear in the form of symptoms in the empirical reality. They undermine its unity by producing certain gaps in the social structure, and these gaps are in certain aspects similar to Badiou's presented but unrepresented entities, or to Ranciere's notion part of no part, that appearance is the basic presupposition for emancipatory politic, and its visualization is also practical overcoming of ideology. Althusser himself called these new but hidden logic presented in the logic of capitalism that the oasis of communism, which he defines as, I quote, oasis already exist in the interspecies of our society, where relationships based on the market do not prevail. That is to say, where exploitative class relation and the domination of the state do not prevail. End of quote. We can say thus that the function of ideology is not to deny these gaps, is to deny that these gaps are symptoms that manifest hidden presupposition of new logic of social forms, symptoms that refers to an invisible field of contemporary state. When this function of ideology is successful, every social phenomenon is interpreted as a phenomenon belonging to capitalist form, and it encloses our thinking within this frame. So that make us, we were talking about Petr, that there is no alternative. So the alternative to the given system remains invisible. We can thus propose a definition of ideology that ideology denies the existence of symptoms and makes impossible to recognize symptoms as the symptoms. By doing this, the possibility of an alternative rests invisible, and the dominant social relations are legitimate because there is no other alternative. The effect of this function is that we cannot imagine other social forms, and all of us are Foucaultians. I don't have much more time, so I would say that I had some passage concrete example of the symptoms. We can say that when we were talking about the problem of the valorization of capital and about how the society is working in the morning, it's a process without subject that immanent logic of valorization of capital is going. And if it's true that this valorization reached to its limits, that because the living labor variable capital is getting eluded from this process as a only source of the value, the production of the surplus value is limited. So the system must produce something what is not typical for capitalist logic, and because the system which will have 30 or 40 or 50% of unemployment people is not more possible. They must introduce some new elements of new social logic as a basic universal basic income, which undermines in the field of subjectivity the ideological presupposition of capitalism as a competition, the negation of the necessary to wage labor, and so on and so on. But what ideology makes that it presents these phenomena not as a symptom of some potential new order, but as a simple fact of how the capitalism works. So I would just go to finish. If it's true that in the process of the capitalism itself is produced something what we can call gaps or and so on, we can say that the role of ideology or of the possibility of overdetermination or emergence of some other subject must be will be more it is more important or more probable than in the period when the logic is consolidated. And so if we can speak about some alternative, I would say very hyperbolically that we don't see the alternative because it rests in the invisible field and the logic of new alternative is not constituted. But I think that that's why we need in political analysis symptomatic reading in order to be able to recognize the presupposition of new hidden logic and to be recognized the gaps in the logic of the system and void space that could be eventually subversion from there, and this others are pointed in other contexts in his text that from where the new prince came up and found a new state, a state capable of lasting and a state capable of growing. So